Alrighty, folks. Welcome. First of all, I'd like to inform everybody in the audience that we are recording this special webinar. My name is Eli Saltzman. I'm an associate research professor of Israel Studies and the director of the Gildenhorn Institute for Israel Studies at the University of Maryland at College Park. I'd like to express my deepest gratitude to Avis Koyman and Srusti Suresh for all their assistance behind the scenes. Everything that they do makes this and other events possible and easy to a large extent. I'd like to thank the audience for joining us today for a special book talk titled Ghosts of a Holy War, the 1929 Massacre in Palestine that ignited the Arab-Israeli conflict, featuring Yardena Schwartz, whom I'll introduce momentarily. I'd like to mention that our next special webinar is an online talk titled Strategic Partners, Exploring Israel-India Relations Under Modi's Leadership, featuring Dr. Lauren Dagan Amos of Bar-Ilan University. That online event will take place on Tuesday, March 25th at 12:30 p.m. Eastern. For more information and to register, please visit www.israelstudies.umd.edu. Now, the events of 1929 in Palestine, often overshadowed by later conflicts, were a turning point in the history of the region. The violent outbreaks that swept through cities like Hebron, Sfat, Jerusalem left a deep and lasting imprint, shaping the trajectory of Jewish-Arab relations for generations to come. These events were not just a moment of tragic bloodshed, they were a seismic shift in the struggle over land, identity, and belonging, foreshadowing the tensions and the conflicts that would follow. Tonight, we will explore the echoes of that history, how the ghosts of 1929 continue to haunt the present. How did this violence erupt? What role did religious and political forces play? And how did the massacre alter the course of the Arab-Jewish conflict, laying the groundwork for the national struggle that defines Israel and the Palestinian territories to this very day? It is my pleasure and honor to introduce today's speaker, Yardena Schwartz. She's an award-winning journalist and an Emmy-nominated, soon to be Emmy awarded producer who was based in Israel for a decade until 2023. Her reporting has appeared in the New York Times, the New York Review of Books, the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, Time Magazine, National Geographic, Foreign Policy, and Foreign Affairs, among others. Yardena previously worked at NBC News, including stints at the Today Show, Nightly News with Brian Wilson, and MSNBC's Andrea Mitchell Reports. She graduated with honors from Columbia Journalism School in 2011, received an Emmy nomination for her work at MSNBC in 2013, and the Religion News Association's Award for Excellence in Magazine Reporting in 2016. She now lives, as we just learned, in New York's Hudson Valley with her husband and children. Ghost of a Holy War is her first book. Yardena, the virtual floor is yours. You will speak for about 30 to 35 minutes, and then we will open the virtual floor for questions. Please feel free to type those in the designated Q&A box at the bottom. I'll moderate that. Yardena, please go ahead, my friend.
Thank you so much, Eli, for the introduction and for having me here tonight, and thank you all for tuning in. Ever since October 7th, many people, including the head of the UN, have argued that there was context to Hamas's massacre. The atrocities committed against innocent men, women, and children didn't happen in a vacuum, they said. They were right, only their context was all wrong. I'm here tonight to speak to you about the true context behind October 7th and everything we are witnessing today. 2 decades before the State of Israel was born, the British Mandate of Palestine was the scene of a massacre that was hauntingly similar to the massacre of October 7th. The massacre of one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities was both more deadly and more gruesome than the infamous Kishinev pogrom, which drove tens of thousands of Jews to flee Eastern Europe. The massacre of Jews in Hebron nearly a century ago was on a scale far smaller than October 7th, and yet it transformed the region into the one we know today. It was another Shabbat morning on August 24th, 1929, when 3,000 Muslim men armed with swords, axes, and daggers marched through the ancient Jewish quarter of Hebron, the second holiest city in Judaism, burial place of Abraham. That morning, rioters went from house to house, stabbing, torturing, raping, and in some cases, castrating and burning their unarmed victims alive. The rioters who broke into Jewish homes that day didn't distinguish between men, women, and children, young and old. Infants were slaughtered in their mothers' arms. Children watched as their parents were butchered by their neighbors. Women and teenage girls were raped. Elderly rabbis and yeshiva students were castrated, and ancient synagogues looted and destroyed. 67 unarmed Jewish men, women, and children were slaughtered, and dozens more wounded. Many of the victims knew their assailants by name. Until that day, the rioters had been their friends, neighbors, coworkers, business partners, and landlords. Yet amid the horrors were heroes. At least 200 Jews were saved that day by their Muslim neighbors, who hid them in their homes or stood at guard outside of their homes, risking their own lives in the process. The roughly 500 Jews who survived the attack were evacuated by the British authorities who ruled Palestine and told never to return. The British had proved incapable of protecting their Jewish subjects. The massacre in Hebron didn't just decimate one of the world's most ancient Jewish communities. It also ended centuries of peaceful coexistence in the city of Abraham, patriarch of both the Jewish and Arab people. Jews had lived in Hebron since the days of Abraham. Their pious lives were centered around the tomb of the patriarchs and matriarchs, where the forefathers and mothers of the Jewish people are buried. For centuries, Muslims and Jews had lived harmoniously together in Hebron. This is when that harmony ended and the reality we know today began. I began writing Ghosts of a Holy War 4 years before October 7th, and now, 17 months into just the latest battle between Hamas and Israel, this century-old massacre and its aftershocks hold the key to understanding how we got here and what needs to change if the people who share this tortured land are ever to know peace. My work on this book began in 2019 when I was introduced to a family in Memphis, Tennessee, with an epic story to tell. In 2009, this family discovered a mysterious box of letters in their attic. Those hundreds of pages of letters were written in the late 1920s by their late uncle, who was murdered in the Hebron Massacre. David Shainberg was 22 years old when he sailed to Palestine in 1928 to study Torah in the land where its stories had unfolded. While studying at the prestigious Hebron Yeshiva, David wrote long poetic letters to his family in Memphis every week. In his letters, he described Hebron's biblical beauty and serenity and the remarkable relations between the city's Jewish minority and its Arab majority. He wrote of weddings and holidays where rabbis and Muslims danced side by side. He wrote of the Jewish clinic where needy Arabs and Jews alike received free treatment. Before I read David's letters, I knew little about the massacre in Hebron or the history of that holy city. When I was introduced to his family in Memphis, I was a freelance journalist based in Tel Aviv, and I had been to Hebron only once. That brief visit was so disturbing that I never returned until I started working on this book. In the spring of 2011, I was a student at Columbia Journalism School on a one-day tour of Hebron with Breaking the Silence, an organization founded by Israeli soldiers who had served in Hebron and objected to the injustices they had been forced to carry out. They wanted Israelis to know what was being done in the name of security. Nightly raids into randomly chosen Palestinian homes, beatings of those who resisted, stifling restrictions of movement on the streets where they lived, and more. Walking the empty streets of Hebron that day, past barbed wire, Israeli soldiers, and checkpoints, I gazed up at what I thought was an abandoned home, only to glimpse a pair of tiny hands gripping the iron bars of her window. I locked eyes with a young Palestinian girl who peered down at me like a caged bird. And it struck me in that moment that as a graduate student from New York, I had more freedom on this little girl's street than she did. That day, a city that should be a monument to Judaism's ancient past became for me a symbol of Israel's moral unraveling. Yet at the time, I had no idea how that unraveling had taken place. Like David, I too was a young American Jew who had moved to our ancient homeland. David came as a scholar of ancient texts, seeking a more spiritual connection with God and the Jewish people. David was a young, observant Jew who was deeply skeptical of the secular Zionist movement. I was a journalist and a secular Zionist who was deeply disturbed by the direction Jewish extremists were steering the Jewish state. After moving to Tel Aviv in 2013, I stayed away from Hebron. But then, after reading David's letters and his diary from before he moved to Hebron, I embarked on a journey to discover how Hebron, the cradle of the Jewish people and once a beacon of coexistence in Palestine, had become the antithesis of coexistence in Israel and Palestine. I wanted to understand why the return of a persecuted people to our native land had led to the misery of another people who believe their homeland has been taken from them. Did it need to be this way? Over the course of 3 years, I spent hundreds of hours with Israelis and Palestinians in Hebron, and I came to understand why this conflict persists and why every peace effort has failed. And no, it didn't need to be this way. The causes of the 1929 massacre and its haunting echoes today are key to understanding the true nature of this conflict and how we can find a way out of it. In 1929, there was no Israeli occupation, no Israeli soldiers, there was no state of Israel. Jews at the time were a weak minority in British Mandate Palestine, just 20% of a population of less than 1 million people. When the British conquered Palestine from the Ottoman Empire at the end of World War I, they ended centuries of restrictions on Jewish immigration. The Balfour Declaration of 1917 enabled tens of thousands of Jews to flee the pogroms of Eastern Europe and build new lives in their homeland, joining the Jewish natives of Palestine, whose families had been there for generations. The Balfour Declaration promised that in building a Jewish home in Palestine, not a Jewish state, the rights of the Arab community would be protected. Yet for nearly 1,000 years of Muslim rule in Palestine, Jews had been second-class citizens. Many Muslims opposed the prospect of Jews becoming equal citizens. Chief among them was the British-appointed Grand Mufti of Jerusalem, Haj Amin al-Husseini. As the leader of Palestinian Muslims under British rule, Husseini was the father of the Palestinian national movement. What led to the riots of 1929 was a campaign of propaganda he initiated in order to quiet dissent and criticism from his own people. Husseini had long been accused of corruption, nepotism, and misappropriation of religious funds that he oversaw. Beginning in 1928, just as David Schoenberg arrived in Hebron, the Grand Mufti began to convince his people that the Jews of Palestine were planning to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. Al-Aqsa sits atop the ruins of the ancient Jewish temples in Jerusalem. Known as the Temple Mount, it is the single holiest site in Judaism. But in 1929, the Temple Mount was off limits to Jews. The holiest place they were permitted to pray was the Western Wall, the last remnant of the ancient Jewish temple. Using xenophobic language that was very similar to the anti-immigrant rhetoric we hear from so many politicians today, Husseini galvanized Islamic sentiment against the country's Jewish minority and against rising Jewish immigration from Eastern Europe, where pogroms were raging. In Arabic, the riots of 1929 are known as the Al-Buraq Rebellion. Al-Buraq is the Arabic name for the Western Wall. According to the Grand Mufti, Jews who were demanding British protection to pray in peace at the Western Wall without being attacked by Muslims were actually seeking to destroy Al-Aqsa Mosque. The wall, the Mufti claimed, was the Jews' first step in working to conquer Al-Aqsa to rebuild their ancient temple. In August of 1929, hundreds of Jews marched to the Western Wall in protest against the British failure to protect Jewish worshippers from increasing Muslim attacks. Their march was peaceful, but Arab leaders and the Arabic press claimed otherwise. According to them, Jews had attacked Muslim men, raped Muslim women, and cursed the Prophet Muhammad. None of that was true, but the truth had become irrelevant. In sermons at Al-Aqsa on August 23, 1929, imams called on the faithful to defend Islam with their blood. Armed worshippers flowed from the mosque and down to the Old City, where they attacked Jewish passers-by and set fire to Jewish businesses. The riots quickly engulfed Palestine, killing 133 Jews within days and wounding more than 400 more. The Jewish communities of Gaza and elsewhere were evacuated by British authorities to Tel Aviv. Yet the Jews of Hebron, a haven of coexistence, paid the heaviest price. suffering more casualties and more brutality than any other Jewish community in Palestine. Refusing to believe the warnings ahead of time, Jewish leaders in Hebron had rejected offers of protection from the Haganah, the underground Jewish defense force that would later become the nucleus of the IDF. When members of the Haganah visited Hebron just a day before the riots erupted, they were told to leave. Our Arab neighbors are our friends, the Jewish leaders of Hebron insisted. They didn't believe or want to believe that their Arab neighbors would hurt them. After all, the Jews of Hebron in 1929 were not Zionists building the foundations of a Jewish state. They were pious Jews living a quiet existence centered around the Torah. That the massacre did happen there was a turning point for Zionism and the conflict itself. In 1929, Zionism was not a mainstream Jewish value. Many traditional Jews in Palestine, including David Schaimberg himself, disdained the young movement as a secular contamination of Judaism. The return of the Jewish masses to Zion, they believed, could only be realized through God's will and the arrival of the Messiah. Many American Jews also rejected Zionism, fearing it could threaten their fragile place in American society. That antagonism was threatened by the Hebron Massacre, which epitomized the tragedy of the stateless, powerless Jew. For centuries, Jews had been treated as unwanted strangers precisely because they lived in exile. European anti-Semites often told Jews, "Go back to Palestine." Now they had come home, only to be told they didn't belong here either. The failure of British forces to protect Jews in Palestine led them to unite around Zionism. Many of those who had opposed it now agreed that they could only be safe in their own country under the protection of their own army. After the massacre, the British sent a royal commission to Palestine to determine the causes of the riots. In 1930, that commission pardoned the Mufti, allowing him to maintain the powerful position they had appointed him to. Instead, the British blamed the riots on the peaceful Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall. Muslim fears of Jewish immigration were legitimate, the commission concluded. And so, 1 year after the massacre, the British issued new policies, vastly limiting Jewish immigration and land purchases. When the Mufti led a violent rebellion against the British in 1936, the British responded by abandoning the Balfour Declaration altogether, and with it the promise of establishing a Jewish home in Palestine. Against the backdrop of Nazi persecution, the Jews of Eastern Europe were essentially banned from immigrating to Palestine. During and after the Holocaust, tens of thousands of European Jews who arrived on Palestine's shores were sent back to Europe or detained in British internment camps in Palestine and in Cyprus. Only after his rebellion killed a British official did the British finally decide to arrest the Grand Mufti, yet he fled the country and allied himself and his cause with Adolf Hitler. Between 1941 and 1945, the Grand Mufti was lavishly paid by the Nazis as their leading voice in the Arab world. Living in a Nazi-financed estate in Berlin, the first leader of the Palestinian people led the Arab branch of Joseph Goebbels' Ministry of Propaganda. He issued Arabic radio broadcasts of Nazi propaganda throughout the Arab world and recruited tens of thousands of Muslims to fight for the Nazis. Husseini toured concentration camps and befriended the architects of the final solution, including Himmler. Hitler himself considered Husseini an honorary Aryan. When the war ended, Husseini was wanted for Nazi war crimes and placed on the UN's list of Nazi war criminals. Yet once again he fled, first to France, then to Cairo, eventually settling in Beirut, where he led his people's jihad against the Jews of Palestine. His apprentice in that jihad was his cousin Yasser Arafat. The Grand Mufti was the first of many corrupt Palestinian leaders to realize the power of Al-Aqsa and disinformation. Hamas has perpetuated the same lies about Al-Aqsa and Israeli plans to destroy it. Husseini set the formula for every Palestinian leader. Hamas and other Palestinian groups have used lies about Al-Aqsa and other lies to galvanize support and distract from their own inability to lead their people out of perpetual poverty. There is a direct line between 1929 and our current tragic reality. Parallels between then and now are a testament to how little has changed over the course of a century of what remains a holy war. The forces that drove Arabs in Hebron to rape, torture, and murder their unarmed Jewish neighbors 1 century ago are nearly identical to the forces behind October 7th. It's no coincidence that Hamas named its attack on October 7th the Al-Aqsa Flood. Hamas is the direct heir of the Grand Mufti, just the latest defenders of Al-Aqsa against the supposed Jewish plot to destroy it. Much like the rioters of 1929 praised God as they slaughtered men, women, and children, so did Hamas fighters on October 7th in footage they themselves uploaded to social media. The lies we hear today, depicting the kibbutzim in southern Israel as stolen land, mirrors the lies told in 1929, in which Jewish immigrants were coming to replace the native population. Just as the Jews who were killed in southern Israel, just as the Jews who were killed in Hebron in 1929 were not Zionists, the Jews killed in southern Israel on October 7th were not settlers. In fact, many of them were left-wing Israelis and peace activists who had spent years trying to help civilians in Gaza. Echoing 1929, dozens of Muslim citizens of Israel risked their own lives to rescue Jewish Israelis from Hamas's attack. Many of those courageous Muslim Israelis paid with their lives. Some were murdered by Hamas on October 7th, while others were kidnapped to Gaza. Those heroes serve as an important reminder. This war is not between Islam and Judaism. It is between those who weaponize religion and glorify violence and those who seek peace. The euphoric celebrations in the West Bank and Gaza on October 7th, and the scenes of Palestinians crowding around Israeli hostages and cheering Hamas's attack will not be forgotten in Israel. The perpetrators of the massacre of 1929 were also hailed as heroes, both then and now. According to Palestinian polls, the vast majority of Palestinians in the West Bank and Gaza supported the attacks of October 7th. We've seen painful reminders of that support in the twisted ceremonies that have accompanied the release of hostages in Gaza. In the immediate aftermath of October 7th, many around the world blamed Israel for the massacre. The atrocities of 1929 were also denied by Arab leaders and blamed on their Jewish victims. The difference was that in 1929, the international community saw through those denials. In newspapers like the New York Times, those lies were presented as lies. 2 days after the massacre in 1929, 35,000 people marched through the streets of Manhattan in protest against the massacre and against the British failure to protect the Jews of Palestine. Similar protests were held in cities around the world. Meanwhile, in cities across America on October 8th, 2023, protesters marched in support of the massacre. Even then, there were accusations of genocide. Many of these protesters consider themselves to be anti-war, pro-peace. Yet the line between 1929 and 2023 cuts through a century of Palestinian leaders' refusal to share this tiny sliver of land with the Jewish people. The Grand Mufti rejected the first two-state solution in 1937 when it was proposed by the British. He did so again in 1947 when the UN voted to partition British Mandate Palestine into an independent Arab state and an independent Jewish state. Palestine could have gained independence for the first time in its history. After all, Palestine had never been independent. It had always been ruled by foreign powers. That could have changed in 1947. Yet while the Jewish leaders of Palestine embraced the UN partition plan, the Mufti and every single Arab state rejected it. The Mufti declared jihad and established the Army of the Holy War. 1,000 Muslim members of the Waffen-SS, men the Mufti had recruited during his time in Berlin, joined that holy war in Palestine. The day the British left Palestine in 1948, the armies of Egypt, Jordan, Syria, Iraq, and Lebanon invaded the newly born state of Israel. This chapter in that holy war against the Jewish state ended with Israel's shocking victory, what Palestinians know as the Nakba, the catastrophe. Yet imagine what could have been if the Mufti and other Arab leaders had agreed to 2 states for 2 people rather than declaring war. The Mufti's political descendants have rejected every single 2-state solution since then. When Israel's offer of a Palestinian state in 2000 was rejected by Yasser Arafat and followed by 5 years of suicide bombings, many Israelis concluded that Palestinians were not interested in peace. And yet, Israel made an even more generous offer again in 2008 Yet again, that offer was rejected. Both times, no alternative was offered. While this commitment to perpetual armed struggle has enriched corrupt Palestinian leaders beyond their wildest dreams, it has made life for the Palestinian people ever more hopeless and the prospects for peace ever more distant. October 7th has now convinced even left-wing Israelis that there really is no partner for peace. The violent rejection of peace by Palestinian leaders is precisely what has created the restrictive policies so many innocent Palestinians suffer from today, including that young girl in Hebron. The lessons of history are key to understanding this intractable conflict and any hope of resolving it. The failure to heed these lessons will keep us in this never-ending cycle of war. I began writing Ghosts of a Holy War 4 years before October 7th, and never once did I imagine that anything even remotely similar to what happened in 1929 would happen again. The fact that it did, and that it is being justified by millions of people around the world, proves that the actual history of this conflict has been ignored for far too long. My hope in writing this book is that it will no longer be ignored. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Yardena. That was very, very impressive and interesting alike. Thank you so much. I appreciate it.
Thank you.
We'll start the conversation, if you don't mind, with a basic question that somebody actually typed in the Q&A box within seconds, I must say. What were the factors that led to the Hebron massacre? Because I must admit that listening to you, I didn't fully understand what happened. What happened in 1929? If it was so cordial, if the relationship was so fantastic before 1929, what happened? What was the trigger? What were the immediate or long-term causes of that? Thank you so much.
Yeah, I mean, it's a great question. It's not like overnight these incredible relations just kind of immediately disintegrated. After all, there were, as I said, people who rescued their Jewish neighbors and didn't fall for this disinformation campaign, but sadly, many did. And as I said, this propaganda had been going on for a year. So for 1 year, not only the Mufti, but pretty much every Muslim official in the land, and I should say, these were Muslim officials. These weren't mayors and secular officials. These were imams, clerics, leaders of the Supreme Muslim Council, which the Grand Mufti oversaw. There was specifically one sheikh in Hebron who was carrying out this propaganda campaign. And in Hebron, he wasn't just saying that the Jews of Palestine were plotting to destroy the Al-Aqsa Mosque, but he also kind of localized that propaganda campaign for Hebron and said that Jews in Hebron were planning to destroy or conquer the Ibrahimi Mosque, which is the Arabic name for the Tomb of the Patriarchs. In 1929, and actually for 700 years under Muslim rule, Jews and Christians, anyone who was not Muslim, was forbidden from entering the Tomb of the Patriarchs, which is pretty ironic considering it was built by Jews. And, it was the Cave of the Patriarchs purchased by Abraham. And then in the first century, it was a Jewish king, Herod, who built the fortress atop that cave so that Jews and others could pray there. With the Muslim conquest of Palestine, it was turned into a mosque, and all non-Muslims were forbidden from entering. And so in 1929, Jews who prayed at the Tomb of the Patriarchs had to do so outside of the tomb. They couldn't go inside. And so these rumors were being spread by imams in the mosque, in Ibrahimi Mosque inside the Tomb of the Patriarchs, and by other Muslim teachers and officials in Hebron, claiming that the Jews in Hebron were going to conquer Ibrahimi Mosque and turn it into a synagogue. So, the power of religious disinformation and the weaponization of Islam was really powerful in Hebron. Hebron, it has always been, and to this day, is a very, very conservative, very religious place, not only for the Muslims who live there, but also the Jews in Hebron are very, very religious. Many of them today, to this day, go to the Tomb of the Patriarchs to pray every single day. At the time, it was the same, only they couldn't go inside. And, so I think it really, this disinformation, the power, the galvanizing power of disinformation shouldn't be underestimated, both then and now.
So let me push back just a bit with your permission on that point, right? Because there were stories of Arab neighbors who protected Jewish families, for example, who hid them, protected them, stood at the door, trying to thwart or to deflect some of the attacks. How do you account for that difference? How do you account for the different response by Arabs A or by Arabs B in that sense?
Well, sadly, I mean, there were only they were courageous, and it's really important to note how many people they saved. I mean, they saved at least 200 people. By some estimates, they might have saved even more than that. But they were just 24 families. 3,000 people participated in the massacre. 3,000 men were actually carrying out these violent attacks. And that's just those who were carrying out the violence. There were also, women and children who were following them after they would attack a home. Their wives and children would go in and loot those homes. So it's more than 3,000 people out of a population at the time. The Muslim population, or the Arab population of Hebron, which was almost entirely Muslim, was 20,000. So you think about the ratio of people who participated, 3,000 out of 20,000. It's really extraordinary, and really depressing to think about how powerful that disinformation campaign was against this Jewish population that was, again, not Zionist. They weren't taking anyone's jobs. They weren't, carrying out any kind of, labor policy that was being carried out by, certain groups Jewish groups in Palestine at the time, where they would only employ Jewish labor and not Arab labor, or, there was no purchasing of land, Arab land, being done by Jews at the time. I mean, these were Jews who were renting their homes from Arab landlords, or if they were, buying land, it wasn't, taking over Arab land, or making, Arab farmers become destitute because they were purchasing the land upon which they had worked. That wasn't happening in Hebron. So, that kind of nationalist element to the riots, which the British kind of determined that was really, the spark that these riots were all about, these fears of Jewish immigration. Maybe that was true in other parts of Palestine at the time, but that doesn't explain the violence in Hebron, nor does it explain it in places like Tzfat, which was a very similar dynamic, where you had Jews, Arabic-speaking Jews, kind of like what you had in Hebron as well. These Arabic-speaking Jews whose families had lived there for generations. They had come after, the Spanish Inquisition, or they had come from, Arab lands, or they were Ashkenazi Jews who had been there for generations. These weren't, recent arrivals who were establishing kibbutzim or something. Even with the students in Hebron, again, they were contributing to the local economy in Hebron. What was interesting is that after the Jewish community in Hebron was essentially expelled in 1929, the economy in Hebron fell apart. There, suddenly you didn't have all of these people shopping in Arab shops, renting homes from Arabs. And there was actually, there is this really interesting predicament where, suddenly these same people who had glorified these attacks and celebrated them were then, complaining that, there were no more Jews living in Hebron to shop at their shops and, contribute to their economy.
So we have a follow-up question from David Siegel, who's a very good friend of the Institute over here. Was there a particular event that triggered the massacre at the specific point in time? Was it just the culmination effects of disinformation, or kind of general bigger trends? Or was there, if you followed this kind of minute by minute, is there a point where you said, aha, this is the turning point, this is where it escalated from 0 to 100 within seconds?
Yes. So that is actually why the Shaw Commission, this British commission that came out with its report in 1930 and blamed this Jewish demonstration at the Western Wall, that was the spark. But I mean, the idea that they were to blame for,
right, because it wasn't in Hebron itself, right? It was kind of
in Jerusalem. It was
spatial. It was kind of in the surroundings, but it's not in Hebron itself.
No, but the riots weren't just in Hebron. The riots were across the country,
I got you.
and they spread to every Jewish community in Palestine. They began in Jerusalem on August 23rd, 1929, and that was about 10 days after this march to the Kotel
Mm.
by. So first of all, it was on Tisha B'Av that this demonstration occurred. On the eve of Tisha B'Av, 10,000 Jews prayed, not at the Western Wall at the time. It was a very very claustrophobic area. It was like this tiny little alleyway. It's nothing like we know the big giant plaza we know today. It was very small. But that night when 10,000 Jews came to the area of the Western Wall to pray on Tisha B'Av, on the 9th of Av, they were surrounded by a line of British soldiers. Sorry, not British soldiers. There weren't British soldiers in Palestine until after this massacre. It really kind of began the Palestine military force that the British sent. It was a direct result of the riots in 1929. Before the riots, all they had was a police force. The vast majority of those police officers were Arab men. Very few of them were Jewish or British. And what happened was the day after that very somber, very, spiritual demonstration of Jewish prayer at the Western Wall, there was a more nationalistic demonstration where several hundred revisionist Zionist youth marched to the Western Wall in protest against the British and their failure not only to protect Jewish worshippers from prayer, because, the night before they had a line of policemen protecting them, but that was the first time that protection had been there, and all of the other occasions where Jews were attacked, nothing had been done to protect them or to prevent those attacks from happening, and the British had done nothing to stop this disinformation campaign that was being carried out by a British appointed official, the Grand Mufti. So they were protesting this demonstration by those young Zionist demonstrators on the day of Tisha B'Av was directed at the British, and yet it served to it worked into the hands of the Grand Mufti, who was able to say, look, they're marching to the wall, they're chanting, the wall is ours, they're singing, they were actually singing Hatikva, which was not yet, obviously Israel didn't exist yet, it wasn't the national anthem, but they were also carrying flags with the Magen David on it. Like it felt very nationalist. And so it really it really played into the Grand Mufti's hand, and was able to serve as the proof that he needed to show his people, look, everything I've been warning you, it's happening. They're going to conquer the Western Wall. From there, they're going to take over Al-Aqsa. And we can't let that happen. You need to, we need you to come out and defend Islam and defend Al-Aqsa against the Jews. And from that day forward, everything just spiraled out of control. So it wasn't that there wasn't violence between that day and when the massacre in Hebron happened, but it was like these small attacks and counterattacks. So Arabs would attack Jews, and then, young Zionists would go and carry out a retaliatory attack. And what happened on August 23rd, 1929 was Friday. Friday prayers. Thousands of armed villagers had come out from outside of Jerusalem. Jerusalem at the time was a majority Jewish city. So people, Arabs from within Jerusalem, but many Arabs from outside of Jerusalem had been told to come to Al-Aqsa that day to stand up against this Jewish plot and to save Al-Aqsa, to defend Islam. And right after Friday prayers that day on August 23rd, 1929, is when they began to attack Jewish worshipers, set fire to Jewish businesses. That's when the riots began in Jerusalem, and they just kind of spread from Jerusalem to every other Jewish city, Jewish town, kibbutzim. And so while the Haganah was very active in Jerusalem and, of course, in Tel Aviv. Tel Aviv was an all-Jewish city. There were no casualties in Tel Aviv. There were, attacks in Jaffa, but because, you had armed Jews defending against these attacks in so many places, you didn't see the kind of casualties and the kind of atrocities you saw in Hebron, where this, very pious, peaceful community was completely defenseless. They had, of course, refused offers of help because they were so sure that nothing would happen to them. when they turned down those offers of protection from the Haganah, one of their reasons was not just our relations are so good with our Arab neighbors, but also when previous outbursts of violence had occurred in other years. For instance, in 1920, the Grand Mufti had actually incited another riot. It was much smaller, far fewer casualties, just a few people. I mean, not to negate the tragedy of deaths, but, you know, compared to what happened in 1929, there were just a few casualties compared, you know, and not the kind of massive upheaval that you saw across the country that you saw in 1929. In 1920, he organized this much smaller riot and actually fled arrest by the British. He had been wanted for arrest by the British in 1920. He fled to Transjordan, where he hid out with Bedouin tribes. And eventually, the reason he was appointed by the British, and the man who appointed him was ironically a Jewish Zionist. He was the first British High Commissioner of Palestine, Herbert Samuel, who was celebrated upon his arrival by the Jewish population of Palestine, but was greeted with a lot of you know, kind of suspicion, you know, justifiably by the Arab population, by Arab leaders. And so his thought, you know, his mistake was that, you know, his thinking was to keep his enemies close. The Grand Mufti was clearly this, you know, very young leader. He wasn't a shoo-in for the role of Grand Mufti. He actually came in last in the election for Grand Mufti, but he and Herbert Samuel actually managed to kind of finagle the outcome of the election so that he was appointed Grand Mufti, despite the fact that he was, you know, this rabid anti-Semite. The other men who had ran against him were not. And, you know, it's really, you know, it's interesting to think what could have happened if one of these other men had been chosen, who had been Grand Mufti and not him. You know, who knows? Maybe we wouldn't have seen this disinformation campaign ever occur. Maybe today we wouldn't have, you know, maybe there would be a two-state solution since 1947. I mean, it's really just incredible to imagine what all of the things that could be different today had Herbert Samuel not appointed this man as the leader of Palestinian
Well,
Muslims.
yeah, well, definitely. This goes into kind of the heart of the study of history, or the counterfactuals, or the kind of the alternative uh, history kind of approach. We have a couple of very technical, or perhaps very specific questions. Wasn't the massacre more directed towards Ashkenazi Jews than Sephardi Jews? I've never heard about
No.
that. Was there any differentiation there? Was there?
So actually, about half of the casualties in Hebron were Sephardi Jews, Mizrahi Jews, Arabic-speaking Jews who had until then been closer with their Arab neighbors than their Ashkenazi neighbors, because at the end of the day, they were much more similar. They had much more in common with the Arabs than with the Ashkenazim. They were very patriarchal, the Sephardi and Mizrahi Jews at the time, very conservative, very traditional, and they were slaughtered by their friends and neighbors. In fact, many of the victim testimonies or the survivor testimonies, there were, you know, wives who said that their husbands were killed. They remembered their husbands saying, "But we're natives, you know, but we're like you. Why, you know, why are you attacking us? Or we're your friends?" You know, they also couldn't believe that it was happening up until the very moment that they were killed. Even many of the Ashkenazim who were killed weren't recent arrivals. They had been there for generations. They spoke Arabic because they had spent their lives in, you know, this Arab majority city. And there's one instance where it felt as if maybe the targets of certain groups of rioters were the you know, outsiders. In one case that's really kind of characteristic of what happened in Hebron, the home of this one of the Jewish leaders of Hebron. His name was Eliezer Dan Slonim. His father was the chief Ashkenazi rabbi of Hebron, but Eliezer himself, he was a businessman. He was the head of the Hebron branch of the Anglo-Palestine Bank. He was friends with a lot of the Arab businessmen and Arab leaders in Hebron, and he had been promised by his friends and neighbors and business partners that nothing would happen to the Jews of Hebron. And even that morning when the riots erupted in Hebron, several of his friends gathered outside his home and knocked on his door and said, stay inside, we'll protect you, we're sitting outside. And it wasn't just Eliezer's family that was inside his home. 70 Jews had taken refuge in his home, kind of assuming that his home would never be touched, that this was the safest place they could be in Hebron. And in the end, not only was Eliezer killed, he was the first person to be killed in that home. His wife was also slaughtered, and she was raped. Their 5-year-old son was murdered. Their 11-month-old son, just barely survived. And in his home alone, out of 70 people who had been hiding in his home, more than 24 of them were killed. And before the mob entered his home, they said to him, we'll spare you if you hand over the foreigners among you, because they knew that so many people had taken refuge in his home, including people who were vacationing in Hebron from Tel Aviv. It's hard to imagine today if you know what Hebron is like today, but at the time, Hebron was a favorite vacation destination in the summertime for people living in Tel Aviv and Jerusalem because of its climate. It's high up in the mountains. It's a much cooler climate in the summer. So perhaps that's what they meant when they told him, hand over the foreigners among you. I'm not sure if they meant Ashkenazim versus Sephardim, because Eliezer was Ashkenazi, but he was a local. And he said no. He said, there are no foreigners among us. We Jews are all family. And he was the first to be killed.
All righty. I'm going to ask another question from the audience that pertains to 1929, and then kind of switch gears a bit and talk about then and now and then. Richard's asking, there is a fringe element today of Jews who talk of building the third temple. They are few, but they make a lot of noise. Was there such talk in 1929? In other words, was there a messianic movement, nevertheless, something that kind of was organic to 1929 Hebron, or before that, of course?
That's an amazing question. And I think it's really interesting, kind of the parallels, because today, yes, we have these fringe elements, but obviously they are fringe. Obviously, they do not speak for the majority, not even close to the majority of Israelis. They do not represent Israeli policy by any measure. And yet those fringe kind of elements serve to work into the hands of, the disinformation campaign around Al-Aqsa. And, within the Arabic press and within, the Palestinian Authority and Hamas, those elements are not portrayed as fringe. They are portrayed as, just the overall Israeli or Jewish plot to take over Al-Aqsa and rebuild the temple. So similarly, in 1929, there was no, effort to rebuild the temple. At the time, there was also kind of a recognition that even if there wasn't this Muslim ban on accessing the Temple Mount, religious Jews would never have prayed on the Temple Mount in 1929 because of the halachic ruling against, potentially entering the Holy of Holies and all of that. But what did exist in 1929 was a very innocent, and yet, looking back, it was very naive of them to think it was innocent. There was this kind of tendency among the Jews in Palestine, so the old Yeshuv, to do fundraising efforts in the diaspora using imagery of the ancient temple. And so they would send, these brochures and these, postcards would show the Temple Mount with the temple on it. And what that did was that worked into the hands of people like the Mufti, who showed those fundraising campaigns as proof that the Jews were planning to rebuild their temple. Like, look, they're raising funds to destroy Al-Aqsa and rebuild their temple, when really it was just, nostalgia. It was art, the same way many people today, many Jews today have paintings in their home of the Beit HaMikdash, the ancient temple, but it doesn't mean that they are actively working to rebuild the temple. So it's interesting, kind of the parallels between how these kind of, today it's fringe elements who actually do want to rebuild the temple and are trying to bring lambs to sacrifice every year around Passover. Then it wasn't people actively working to do it, but it was, nevertheless used as kind of proof.
Absolutely. Somebody actually quoted from your book, Page 244, very specific question. And the quote goes as follows: as it had been before, and as it has since, Palestinian terrorism pushed the goal of a Palestinian state even farther into the distance. So considering the scale of October 7th, the question goes, and everything since, what are the prospects for peace, if any, do you see? Yeah, this is a tough one, but if you're thinking about the then and now, so what are the lessons learned, so to speak?
Well, I think it's pretty clear to anyone paying attention to the debates around what is going to happen with the Palestinians. Like, talks of a Palestinian state right now are very much kind of abstract, and I don't think anyone imagines that a Palestinian state is going to be established in the next year or even in the next decade. I think that it's very clear that the Palestinians will need an entirely new kind of leadership, new kind of education system, new society, really. You know, there needs to be a massive re-education, de-radicalization program. If not for, you know, Israeli lives, like for the Palestinians themselves. Like, forget about what, you know, what those radicalized people might do to Israelis or Jews or anyone. Just think about, you know, their own, if they want to have a state, no one is going to trust them with land again. Like, there's not going to be another land for peace agreement between Israel and the Palestinians after Israel saw what happened when they left Gaza. I mean, no Israeli leader would be able to do that with any kind of mandate from the Israeli population, unless, you know, any kind of land for peace deal was not just not going to be a Palestinian state, but was going to be, you know, still ruled in some way by Israel to ensure there won't be attacks. Like, and that's as a direct result of Palestinian terrorism. And if 1929 served to strengthen Zionism, and it did, you know, massively, and kind of create the trajectory of this conflict, we can only imagine what October 7th is going to do. I mean, you already see the shift in Israeli society where people who once favored a two-state solution, you know, where Israelis who once favored a two-state solution were the ones who suffered the most death and destruction on October 7th. I mean, as I said in my presentation, so many of the people who were kidnapped or killed that day had been, you know, left-wing activists protesting against Netanyahu's far-right government, or they had been peace activists, or they had, you know, volunteered their time to bring sick children from Gaza to hospitals in Israel. And the fact that these people suffered the greatest catastrophe at the hands of the very Palestinian, you know, the people who they were advocating for so many years is going to deal a really devastating blow to the kind of peace movement in Israel. You know, that peace movement was already kind of in tatters as a result of the Second Intifada and all of the refusals of Israel's peace offers. So I think that right now the prospects for peace are really dim. But I also think that there is hope, because I think that many more people today realize that there needs to be kind of a massive, you know, de-radicalization, re-education, new kind of leadership within Palestinian society, and that we can't continue the same failed thinking that has informed so much of the peace negotiations over the last decades, where it's just, okay, let's just bring the two parties together and they'll come to an agreement. You know, you can't, that's not going to work so long as every single agreement is either going to be rejected by Palestinian leaders in the end, or undermined by, you know, a very large segment of society that doesn't want peace.
Excellent. So before we move to a kind of a more kind of the authors behind the scene kind of a question, we have a question here from one of our faculty members. You referred to Hamas as a continuation of the Mufti's leadership. What do you see as some of the similarities and differences between Palestinian leadership of the time, 1929, and the current one, particularly vis-a-vis, my apologies for the fragmentation of Palestinian leadership between the West Bank and Gaza?
So it's not just Hamas, really. I mean, the Palestinian Authority and, its leaders, whether they're, Muslim, clerics that have been appointed by Abbas or even Abbas himself, there has been this adoption of the Mufti's tactics of deflecting criticism from their own failures and their own corruption by, creating this scapegoat of, Israel plotting to destroy Al-Aqsa or other disinformation. I mean, think about, there's been so much disinformation just in the last year as a result of this war. I mean, when Palestinian Islamic Jihad fired a rocket that ended up killing dozens of Palestinians outside of a hospital, and immediately that Hamas turned that into, no, Israel, it was an Israeli airstrike, they killed 500 people, and we saw how the media just ate that up. And, as a journalist, I've been really horrified to see how so much of the disinformation in the last year and a half has been just disseminated by the media, not just by Hamas and Hezbollah and other terror groups. So back to, how Hamas and other, Palestinian groups kind of have carried on the Mufti's legacy. Also, their weaponization of Islam and Al-Aqsa. I mean, this idea that there is this Jewish plot to destroy Al-Aqsa is not only being perpetuated by Hamas, but by the Palestinian Authority as well. And Mahmoud Abbas has also used that same language throughout his career. I think that it's really interesting when you look at the Holocaust denial or Holocaust diminishing that is so prevalent in Palestinian society. It's really kind of makes you scratch your head when you think about how, the first leader of the Palestinian people wasn't just a supporter of the Nazis. He was a Nazi. He was wanted for Nazi war crimes. So I think that kind of the way his legacy is carried out in a way with the Holocaust is kind of an inverted legacy, instead of, they're and those same people now call Israel a Nazi power and accuse Israel of carrying out a Holocaust in Gaza. There's this kind of tendency of, people who are guilty of something to blame their actions on the victims. And so, the tendency that we saw after the massacre of 1929, the riots in 1929, when Arab leaders and the Arabic press either denied the atrocities or outright blamed them on their Jewish victims. In Hebron, they claimed that it was yeshiva students who had killed Jews in Hebron in order to raise funds from the diaspora. Of course, after October 7th, we saw a similar, widespread denial and blame on Israel. So whether it was blaming Israel for killing its own people on October 7th, these claims that, there was, the Hannibal directive was used. Yeah. This preposterous claim, of course, that directive was used and Israel admitted to it, that it was used in, maybe one case, and there were definitely casualties as a result. But to claim that all of the people killed on October 7th were killed by Israel is just absolutely ridiculous. And yet, we saw that same kind of denial and justification and victim blaming in 1929 as well.
Alrighty, so we have a question from a member of the audience. How did you envision the book and how did it change post October 7th, right? Because you started working on it several years before October 7th, so you probably had an idea or kind of an image in your mind how it should look like, feel like, or read like. Did it change? Do you read it differently now?
Well, the book completely changed as a result of October 7th. I was actually halfway through my manuscript on October 7th, and I had to kind of just take a step away from the book, from writing my book for a month or two while I, tried to digest what had just happened. And to do that, I went back to reporting. I had taken a break from my work as a journalist just to focus on my book, and I went back to reporting. And I wrote a bunch of stories about the hostages in those first days after October 7th. I had actually just coincidentally, I had left Israel 2 months before October 7th. I had moved to the United States, not because of the conflict, but just because I had become a mother while writing my book. So that's another thing that changed while I was writing the book. I had 2 kids, and I wanted to move back to the States to be closer to my family. But yeah, on October 7th, it really felt as if the testimonies from the victims of October of 1929 were coming to life before my eyes in the most horrific way. And it felt like this book now is so much more important and so much more relevant because it explains so much of what we're seeing. And these haunting parallels tell us so much about how we've gotten to where we are and what really needs to change if we're ever going to get out of this cycle of violence. And so that was what it became after October 7th. The book that I was writing before October 7th was still, obviously about this massacre, but it was really going to focus much more on the transformation of Hebron. So Hebron was really going to be like the main character of the book, aside from David, and kind of showing how through Hebron, with Hebron as kind of a microcosm of the conflict, how this massacre had transformed Hebron into what it is today and how it had transformed Zionism. I was also going to focus much more on this family in Memphis because I thought they were a really illuminating example of the ways in which Zionism has changed over the last century. David Schoenberg was this. If you think about him today, of course he was a Zionist. He moved from the United States to the land of Israel. He was in many of his letters, despite his, it's really funny. He would, in the same letter, call Zionism this vile anti-Jewish movement, and yet say, that he can't wait to move to the Holy Land, that he's, walking in the footsteps of our ancestors, and this language that kind of made you think, wait, but you are a Zionist. Yet it's really kind of illustrative of how anti-Zionism has really transformed over the last century, not just how Zionism has changed, but this family in Memphis is such a beautiful illustration of that, because today David's descendants, his niece, the one who actually entrusted me with these letters and with the telling of this story and gave me and I'm so grateful to her for this. She gave me complete editorial freedom in telling the story, which is really amazing of her. She didn't ask for any kind of say in how I would use David's letters, whether it would focus on him versus Hebron. She just trusted me to do his story justice. And she is today, a very Zionist. Her husband is the president of the Jewish Federation of Memphis. They go to Israel several times a year. They donate to so many different Israeli organizations and causes, and they're very involved in efforts to improve kind of like reform Judaism in Israel. So like they're very progressive in their Zionism as well, which I think is really interesting given David Schoenberg. And I often thought, like, what if David Schoenberg was living in Israel today, which camp would he be in? Would he be a religious Zionist voting for Bezalel Smotrich? Would he be, I don't know. And sadly, we don't know what could have come of David Schoenberg, and he was such a promising young man, and he could have gone on to be this great rabbi and leader of the Jewish people.
What is the role that the massacre plays in the Israeli imagination today? Has it evolved over the years, and how? Has it remained kind of static? It's the massacre. It's something that you talk about in a very very formal way, or has it changed as well? The understanding of Israelis, Jews in Israel more particularly, has it evolved?
That's a really interesting question, because I think for many Jews in the diaspora, the massacre of 1929 is quite unknown. If Jews know about it, it's they maybe know that it happened. They don't know what actually happened or why. For Israelis, most Israelis know about the 1929 massacre in Hebron. It has its own name, Tarpat. It's remembered by its Hebrew date, the acronym for the Hebrew date on the calendar. And Tarpat plays, I think, a pretty significant role in certain sectors of the Israeli population. So after October 7th, there were many Israelis who kind of said, this isn't kind of what I'm saying here, like, this is nothing new. We saw this in 1929 with, Palestinians turning on their peaceful neighbors. But it's definitely not, spoken of that on such a significant level. In the religious Zionist community and the settler community, it's much more well known because it happened in Hebron and because they're much more religious population. And, sadly, I think it's used by certain elements there to kind of prove their theory that there can never be coexistence, that there can never, they'll say, oh yeah, you can never trust the Arabs. And yet they'll ignore the fact that, so many Arab citizens of Israel on October 7th risked their own lives to save hundreds, if not thousands, of Jews from Hamas's attack, just like the Muslims did, the courageous Muslims did in Hebron in 1929. So, it's definitely a significant part of the Israeli consciousness, but it's not really spoken of that often. And I think it might be because it has been kind of co-opted in a way by these elements of in Israeli society who use it as kind of proof, in their words, that there can be no coexistence. And so other elements of Israeli society don't want to give that kind of any credence, so they just are less likely to speak about or point to it as any kind of informative uh, point in history.
So, is there something unique about Hebron itself, right? We can talk about 1929. We can talk about the Goldstein massacre, Shalhevet Pass, uh, a baby who was shot by a sniper at the time. Is there something about this particular place? For example, Israeli Prime Minister at the time, Yitzhak Rabin, kind of considered ceding that territory to the Palestinians as a way to kind of to just put it away, give it away in a way, kind of in a sense, trying to, if we can't control it or control the violence or mitigate it, so let's give it to the Palestinians as a way to leverage that for some kind of, renewing the peace agreement or the kind of faltering Oslo Accords at the time. Is there something unique about this particular pressure cooker, so to speak, kind of an environment?
Yeah, I think that I feel like there's two questions there. So one is, what's unique about the 1929 massacre that makes it such an informative kind of starting point? Well, first of all, the fact that it was 2 decades before the state of Israel was born, at a time when there was no, Jews were such a minority in Palestine, and the fact that this was the starting point for the kind of driving forces of the conflict today, which are, the weaponization of Al-Aqsa, the disinformation spread by corrupt Palestinian leaders, and this, kind of violent rejection of coexistence. That was why I came away from my research of this massacre and concluded that this was ground zero of the conflict as we know it today. Of course, there people will say, okay, no, it goes thousands years back between I'm not arguing that there had never been any kind of tension between Jews and Arabs in Palestine, or between Jews and Judaism and Islam, of course. But the conflict as we know it today, really kind of the paradigm that we are in today was really formed in these riots and in that massacre, and continues to kind of shape the reality we know today. In terms of Hebron, Hebron is very unique. When the Oslo Accords were signed in 1993, Hebron was specifically left out of those accords because it was seen as so sensitive and so important to both sides that it would need its own kind of accords. And that's why in 1997, there was the Hebron Accords, and that was signed by Netanyahu, who agreed to kind of hand over 80% of Hebron to the Palestinian Authority. So today, 80% of Hebron, which is the largest Palestinian city in the West Bank, home to more than 250,000 Palestinians, and just 800 Jews. It's, one of the epicenters of the conflict today because of this. It's because it's one of the most traditional conservative religious places. Sadly, that's why Islamists terrorists often come from Hebron, because it is such a religious place, and there's a lot of support for Hamas in Hebron. And the mayor of Hebron is himself a convicted terrorist who served time in Israeli prison. He was released in a prisoner swap in the 1980s. Very, as always, very lopsided prisoner swap where hundreds of Palestinian terrorists were released in exchange for a couple of kidnapped Israeli soldiers. And he's still mayor today. He was reelected. He's serving his second term as mayor of Hebron. He has expressed no remorse for his attack in 1980, which at the time was the most deadly terrorist attack against Jews in the West Bank. It killed 6 young Jews, including yeshiva students who were coming back from prayers at the Tomb of the Patriarchs to visit a group of women who had actually been squatting in this abandoned Jewish building that was one of the most horrific scenes of the massacre in 1929. It was the Beit Hadassah building, which housed that Jewish clinic I mentioned in my talk, the Jewish clinic where they provided free treatment to needy Arabs and Jews alike. In 1980, there were no Jews living in Hebron at the time. The government had kind of given in to the demands of the settler movement to rebuild the Jewish community in Hebron. They kind of threw them a bone and said, okay, we'll build Kiryat Arba on the outskirts of Hebron. The Israeli government didn't want to reestablish a Jewish presence in Hebron because they were still hoping that they could trade Hebron in a future peace agreement. They didn't want to have to protect Jewish residents in Hebron. They knew that would be a really kind of slippery slope, which it, is to this day. And the Jewish community that exists in Hebron today was established as a direct result of that terror attack that was committed by 4 Palestinian terrorists, including the man who is today mayor of Hebron, and he is today perpetuating this lie that Israel is planning to conquer the Ibrahimi Mosque and kick out all of the Muslims from Hebron. So, he's another kind of heir to the Grand Mufti.
All righty, thank you so much. I think we're out of time now. Officially, I'd like to thank you for a very insightful, extremely interesting presentation. Congratulations on the book. Thank you so much to the audience for joining us today. Don't forget our next webinar on Tuesday, March 25th at 12:30 p.m. Strategic Partners, Exploring Israel-India Relations under Modi's leadership. Thank you so much. Take care. Only good news, only good developments. Thank you so much for joining us today, Yardena. I appreciate it very much. Take care.
Thank you.